Welcome to the part 5 of a 6-part series on understanding the science of exposure in photography for beginners. If you are new to this channel, then I urge you to watch the part 1 through 4 of this series by clicking here. I will also link it in the description below. This will make sense and you will follow the course systematically. And just a recap. In previous 4 parts, we discussed about the factors influencing exposure. They are light level in the scene, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, except for the first factor, that is light level in the scene, which is by and large not under your control. Other 3 factors can be adjusted as per the demand of a situation. Having said that, certainly you can modify the light level whenever you are in a command to do that by use of reflectors and diffusers, which we discussed and covered in part 1 video. Factors 2, 3 and 4, namely aperture, shutter speed and ISO together are called exposure triangle or a triad. These factors can be adjusted to allow optimum light to enter the camera. The parameter in this exposure triangle has to be in synchronization to each other like a geometrical triangle in order to make a well-balanced exposure. Let me explain you in simple words. Triangle has 3 angles and sum of all 3 angles is always 180 degree. That means if the angle A is 45 degree, angle B is 45 degree, then angle C has to be 90 degree. But if angle A is 50 and angle B is 60, then angle C has to be 70 degree. This means that all 3 angles are interrelated and are acting in reciprocation to each other. This is also called a theory of reciprocation. Likewise, factors in an exposure triangle must be in synchronization and must reciprocate with each other to give a proper exposure. Now remember one thing. Aperture and shutter speed will allow the amount of designated light to pass through the lens and enter the camera, whereas ISO of a sensor will decide how much light is required to process that image. This means that if suppose X amount of light is required to enter with a combination of a given shutter speed and aperture, then ISO of sensor must adjust itself to expose or make the image with that X amount of light. Explaining it other way, if suppose ISO of a sensor requires X unit of light for proper exposure, then shutter and aperture combination must allow that X amount of light to pass through the lens and enter the camera. For example, if the aperture allows 25 units of light to enter and shutter speed allows another 25 units, then ISO must be adjusted to make the image with 50 units of light. On the other hand, if suppose ISO requires 100 units of light to make the image, then shutter speed and aperture together must allow this 100 units of light to pass through the lens. It can be 50 plus 50 or 70 plus 30 or 30 plus 70 or 80 plus 20 or even 90 plus 10 or for that matter 25 plus 75 or whatever combinations you can think of. In short, the property of a triangle must be maintained. If I increase the aperture size, that means I am allowing more light to enter. So I need to reciprocally increase the shutter speed or reduce the ISO to compensate for that more light. If I reduce the aperture size, then I need to reduce the shutter speed or increase the ISO to compensate. I hope the concept of reciprocation is clear. Moving forward, we learned about these 3 parameters individually in previous videos, but now the question is, how to decide what exact settings are required in a given light situation? What should be aperture? What should be shutter speed? And what should be ISO? At first glance this looks very intimidating, but by the end of this video, all this will become super easy and you will have grabbed complete understanding on exposure settings. Camera is equipped with a built-in meter which reads the reflected light from the scene and decides the value of these parameters. That means if you are shooting in an auto mode, then camera will assess the light and the scene and then based on its internal intelligence will decide the aperture, shutter speed and ISO which is best suited for exposing the picture in a given light condition. However, in auto mode, you will not have any control over how the camera would decide these parameters. If you wish to have full control or a partial control over this decision making process, then camera gives you that liberty with 4 basic exposure modes, and they are P for program mode, A for aperture priority, S for shutter priority and M for manual mode. Just remember these are Nikon terminology. Another camera brand like say for example Canon will call A as AV mode and S as TV mode. AV for aperture value and TV for time value. In program mode, you decide the ISO and camera will decide the reciprocal aperture and shutter speed. I get these questions frequently many times during my photo safari and during my lectures, that what is the difference between auto mode and program mode. Just remember that in auto mode everything will be decided by the camera. White balance, picture control, everything. But in program mode, all other factors except aperture and shutter speed are decided by you. Coming to the aperture priority mode, here you decide the aperture, and depending on what ISO you have set, camera will decide the reciprocal shutter speed. In shutter priority mode, you decide the shutter speed and camera will decide the aperture size depending on the ISO sensitivity you have set. But if you want control over all these three factors, then use a manual mode. Here again, the inbuilt light meter cursor will assist you in deciding a proper exposure, and it will indicate whether you are going to get an overexposed image or an underexposed image. If the cursor is towards positive side, then the exposure is more, and if it is towards negative side, the exposure is less. Whether to use aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode or a manual exposure mode depends on your preference and to some extent with what you are comfortable with. If you want to have a control over the speed, say if you deliberately want a particular shutter speed to either freeze the motion or reveal it, then use shutter priority mode. I have a full video on creative use of shutter. Link is in the description. Please watch it so that you understand the creative side of using shutter speed. But if your priority is to have control over depth of field, then use aperture priority. I have a link to the video in description wherein I explain the depth of field in detail. I personally use aperture priority in wildlife photography because that way I get complete control over depth of field, which I think is more important, at least for me. However, I constantly keep eye on reciprocal shutter speed and adjust the ISO accordingly. Other way is to keep your ISO to auto and assign a minimum shutter speed so that you do not have to worry about the camera shake. I will have a full video on this later in this channel where I explain all my settings which I use for wildlife photography. So please subscribe to this channel and stay tuned. Program mode will not be of much use in wildlife, but yes, it certainly has its place in general and picnic photography. And of course, manual mode is for those who want everything to be under their control. Some photographers use manual mode with auto ISO. This way, they can decide aperture and shutter speed while ISO takes care of the exposure. So that was about the exposure modes available in the camera. Use them judiciously for better results. Stay tuned to this channel for the next video, that is part 6 of this series. In that video, we will discuss about how the camera reads the light, that is metering method, and also we will discuss about the exposure compensation.